Thank you, Mr President, and I want to acknowledge up front what a magnificent address that was from the Honourable Member for Nelson, and she stole my opening line, which was that the state of the state is an SOS for the state of Tasmania, Mr President. But I concur with all the observations made by the Honourable Member for Nelson. Mr President, I want to acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Muwinina people, a people who did not survive colonisation and invasion. I want to, as a Green, acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and recommit to truth, treaty, justice and the return of lands. Now, Mr President, a true leader, a Premier of this island, Lutruwita, Tasmania, would have made some acknowledgement of Tasmania's Palawa people in his State of the State address, which sets the agenda for the government for the year ahead, but he did not. Mr President. Mr President, I've known Jeremy Rockliff professionally for some 16 years. And the man I saw stand to deliver the State of the State address this year was a stranger to me. He looked like a prisoner, Mr President. Someone who was doing something in his heart he knew was wrong and he didn't really want to do, Mr President. I am certain that Jeremy Rockliff did not write this garbage, divisive, Trumpian speech. And I think, and maybe I'm being too kind here, but I think Jeremy Rockliff is a prisoner of the hard right in his cabinet. And Jeremy Rockliff, as Premier, is being doged. And for members of this place who don't understand the Doge reference, Doge stands for Department of Government Efficiency. It's a creation of the fascist Trump administration and Elon Musk. It's not a real department, but the language that is being used by Trump and Musk to gut the world's largest democracy and its government, to slash public education, sack climate scientists, gut the ETA, sack tens of thousands of veterans. That is very similar language to what we heard in the Premier's State of the State address last Tuesday. We even have fresh back from a gathering of pretty fashy characters, Mr President, in London for a far-right conference. Our Deputy Premier and Treasurer has set up an economic efficiency unit within government, which is a Doge, Mr President. And in his State of the State address, there are a couple of notable absences. There is a number of notable absences. It was notable that the Premier made no mention at all of his divisive flagship infrastructure project, the proposed $1 billion Macquarie Point Stadium. Now, I wonder why, Mr President. He made no mention at all of our island's extraordinary natural environment and how that builds and strengthens our brand and therefore our prosperity. He said nothing, Mr President, about the fires which have ravaged 100,000 acres or hectares or more in the northwest and the west coasts of this beautiful island in the past few weeks. Not one word from our Premier, Mr President. He said nothing about the single biggest concern young people have today, and that is the breakdown of the natural world, our habitat, and global heating, which is verging on global boiling. Mr President, what we have here in this State of the State address, Mr. President, is emptiness, hard right rhetoric, desperation and dishonesty, Mr. President. And I just want to go through some of the points that he made. I mean, honestly, Mr. President, I don't know who wrote this speech, but they should be sacked. And if they're at Font PR, as I suspect, they shouldn't be rehired again as a consultant. It is completely untrue, as the member for Mersey observed, to say that this government was elected with a mandate. It was not, Mr. President. This is a government that went to an election a year early on its knees and came back into Parliament on its knees, having to beg for support from the crossbench and the newly elected JLN members in order to form government. It is a minority government, and that's a statement of fact, Mr. President. It's a minority government that within a year of having stitched up a deal with JLN, walked away from a key component of it, that is the review of the Integrity Commission, ignored another key component of it, that is Salt Lake's economic review, and now Tasmanians are to believe that this government, having ignored respected economist Saul Estlake 5 or 6 months ago, will pay heed to what Mr. Estlake says when he hands down his report to government. This is a government that cannot claim a mandate. And we've had to stay in this place and listen ad nauseum to the government talk about its 2030 strong plan, Mr. President, that it took to the last state election. I'll tell you what it didn't take to the last state election, Mr. President. It didn't take the mass privatisation of public assets. It didn't take a threat to remove regulations that can protect workers' health and safety, that can protect food standards, that can protect the environment, for example. It said nothing of those things. And it has come back in here this year with a Premier who's delivered the shortest State of the State address I've heard in my 16 years in this place, and pretended it has a mandate to sell the family jewels. Mr. President, it does not. And as the Honourable Member for Launceston said yesterday at the closing of her noting of the Premier's address, this might be one of those situations where it's thank goodness for the upper house. In saying that, however, Mr. President, I hope Labor, the Labor opposition, holds true here in protecting the public interest. There has been no case made other than economic desperation caused by 11 years of misplaced priorities for selling the family jewels. Mr. President, and other honourable members have gone through many of those government businesses and state-owned companies and talked about the enormous benefits and dividends they deliver to the people of Tasmania, but also the enormous pride that the Tasmanian people have in those government businesses. Imagine a government talking about selling the MAIB. Mr. President, what was the number the Honourable Member for Murchison put out the other day? It's delivered $895 million in dividends to government since the Liberals came to office. Mr. President, imagine selling Metro. Who would buy Metro, Mr. President?
It'd have to, through you, Mr. President, it would have to go with a subsidy. So what's the difference?
Well, it would have to potentially go with a very significant subsidy, but business is business, Honourable Member, and in all likelihood, and in fact almost certainly, the people of Tasmania who rely on public transport will be paying more to travel. if Metro is privatised.
Or for worse services, most
More, almost unarguably, for worse services. And if you want a good example of how that has happened in other parts of the world, look at what happened to England's rivers and waterways after they privatised public water and sewerage services companies. That island's waterways are an ecological disaster zone for which people are paying higher water and sewerage bills, and because those companies are not viable, they're constantly receiving government bailouts to keep breaking the law. Mr. President, the argument that privatising public assets leads to better services is neoliberal nonsense. Mr. President, because business is business and business needs to make money. And sometimes making profits off the back of essential public services, well, inevitably, Mr. President, it does more harm than it does good. We've also got a government that's ruled out the sale of nothing but hydro. And the only reason they've ruled out the sale of hydro is that they're scared by the political experience of 1998, when their policy position was to sell hydro, and that's before, as Mr. Edmonds pointed out, that's before Tas Networks was formed. Their policy position, which was to sell hydro and its poles and wires, led to, in significant part, the election of the Bacon Labor majority government. Mr. President, we asked the question in the other place the other day about whether the government would rule out the sale of the Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority. No. Apparently, Mr. President, this government is prepared to sell PASMA, which manages not only the Port Arthur Historic Site, it manages the Coal Mines Historic Site and Maria Island, and it does an outstanding job protecting our remarkable World Heritage convict assets, Mr. President. The government would sell PASMA. There's no doubt that the government's looking to sell the public trustee because it's a headache for them, and the notion that you would have a trustee service that provided low-cost estate management and the like is obviously not a notion that this Liberal government supports. Mr. President, we asked about something that the Premier mentioned specifically in his State of the Status speech when he was talking about, it was almost like a shopping catalogue for any corporation that was interested. We asked specifically about why he was so keen to single out the Land Titles Office for potential sale. I tell you what, it's interesting, isn't it, Mr. President? At a time when we've got the Integrity Commission crying out for funds to do its statutory function, the National Preventative Mechanism not funded to perform its statutory function, we've got a government that apparently spent a couple of $1 million tarting up the Land Information System Tasmania. The list, one of our most significant land, tenure and title assets, the most significant, is being polished up with public money for private sale. And we asked the government, have you been approached by anyone to buy the Land Titles Office? We didn't get a straight answer for that. But I was informed quite recently, apparently there's no actual title for the Treasury building, which the government wants to flog. I mean, there's another Tasmanian treasure. They trade for trinkets. But apparently there's no title for the Treasury building. That raises some interesting questions, Mr. President. If the government's going to privatise the Land Titles Office and a private corporation owns and controls all our titles, it raises some questions about properties without titles and what kind of oversight and protection of the public interest there might be there. And while other states have charged towards selling off their Land Titles Office, Mr. President, there is no evidence it's a good idea. And The common sense test tells you it's not something that will work in the public interest.
It won't have to be legislated either, apparently, so we won't have a say.
Well, and this is the thing. It wouldn't have to be legislated. I'm not sure the sale of the Treasury building would have to be legislated. There's a big question mark over the massive deregulation agenda that this government has announced it's having in place. And if we were dealing with a government that had a track record of openness and transparency with the Tasmanian people, Mr. President, I think this would be a different conversation, maybe. This would be a different conversation. But part of the reason we are where we are with this government, and part of the reason the people of Tasmania gave them such a kick in the bum last March, Mr. President, is because ever since they were elected in 2014, what we've got out of this government is arrogance and secrecy. Now, for any member in this place who was here in 2014, I mean, you may or may not have marked it, but the Greens in the other place certainly did. My God, they were smug, Mr. President, when they came back in 2014. They were so smug. By the way, the economic record is factual. The numbers, the economy was turning around in 2013 because the Labor Green government, despite the propaganda you'll hear from government, actually made some really hard decisions, and we really did turn around the budget, Mr. President. And you could see all the economic indicators heading in the right direction in 2013. But I digress with some facts. But what happened is that in 2014 we had the Hodgman, the strong, stable Hodgman majority Liberal government, because they love a slogan, these people, and they believe they're elected with a mandate to smash up the disastrous Labor Green job-destroying forest deal, which, by the way, now they crow about when we're talking about our climate accounts, because also in 2013, what you saw happen as a result of the Tasmanian Forest Agreement is that our emissions went right down. You want to decarbonise, Mr. President? Protect your forests. But again, I digress with facts. So, Mr. President, we have had 11 years of smugness, 11 years of being much, much, much more open to hearing the interests of big business than they have to hearing the aspirations, the fears, the dreams, the frustrations of the Tasmanian people. Because if they had been listening, Mr. President, I don't think we'd be here having the conversations we are now, where we've got homelessness skyrocketing. We still have a housing crisis, incredibly high rents, unaffordable rents. We've got the Liberals in government who for 11 years have done nothing to rein in short-stay accommodation, and now, devastatingly, for any kind of reform in this area, we've got Labor making all the wrong sounds about short-stay accommodation as well. Well, the Greens will stick to making sure that we're trying to rein in short-stay accommodation, and we won't give up. If this Liberal government, since they were elected in 2014, had really been listening to what Tasmanians want, had really been putting the Tasmanian people first, we'd have a world-class public hospital here, Mr. President. We wouldn't have ambulance ramping to the extent that we've had it. We wouldn't have people waiting 2 and 3 years for important elective surgery that becomes more pressing with each month, Mr. President. If they were really listening to the concerns of the Tasmanian people, Mr. President, in the past few years even, we would be here talking about what a great thing it is that we struck a terrific deal with the AFL for our AFL and AFLW teams, and because we've invested $130 million in public funds into upgrading that fantastic facility at York Park, we're really proud that York Park is going to be the home of the AFL and AFLW teams, our Devils. We wouldn't have spent the last 18 months, 2 years, having a divisive community fight about a stadium that Tasmanians don't want, don't need, and can't afford, Mr. President. Now, we need to understand why this government is hard of hearing to the community, Mr. President. And you only need to look at the Australian Electoral Commission data. So we've broken it down, Mr. President, and I raised this in our debate on the donations disclosure, the Greens donation disclosure bill the other night. Over the past 5 years, according to Australian Electoral Commission data, the Tasmanian Liberals have concealed the source of around $15 million in private donations. $15 million, on average $3 million a year, the source of which is hidden, Mr. President. But that money has helped the Liberals here, big business first, Mr. President. That money made sure that, you know, within a metaphorical 5 minutes after the last state election, the Liberals rolled cravenly over to the pokies lobby against the public interest, Mr. President. They went to the election with one policy and one minister who had the honour and the grace to put harm minimisation first in Minister Ferguson. We don't agree on some things, but I tell you what, we agree on that.
Courageous.
Absolutely courageous. And what did Minister Ferguson get for his courage? But anyway, that's a story for another day. So they went to the state election with a strong harm minimisation policy, mandatory pre-commitment, best practice. We've got the right to information that tells us it was almost within the blink of a political eye after the state election that the Liberals rolled over and gave the gambling industry exactly what it wanted, which is no mandatory pre-commitment and some tinkering around facial recognition technology, which we know doesn't work, Mr. President. So there's one example. And of course we saw, sorry, I should have added them in. Of course we saw Labor roll over too, Madam Acting Deputy President. Another example of how that cosy corporate relationship works on this island and has for decades is being experienced by people who live in coastal communities all over the south of this island. We have a salmon industry, multinational salmon corporations which pay peppercorn leases, pay no corporate tax, and are massively under-regulated here, who are allowed to operate in secrecy, who are covered up for by ministers, who won't be open with the people of Tasmania, for example, about the true causes of this mass mortality event, whether there have been any breaches, for example, of depositing or dumping of salmon offal in marine reserves. We can't see the data. We can't see any information about any testing that the Environment Alleged Protection Authority is undertaking, Madam Acting Deputy President.
Just President.
Acting President.
Madam Acting President. Thank you. Thank you. So there's secrecy. There's this unhealthy nexus between this government and multinational corporations which are not here for the people of Tasmania. They're not here for the state of Tasmania. They're here to make profit from public natural resources. Or if you're one of the Batista brothers who spent a bit of time down here trying to get the new business off the ground, and then it gets a bit hot, and I mean literally marine heat wave, a persistent marine heat wave, and then 5,500 tonnes or so of salmon, 1 million or more fish start dying, and a Batista disappears, well, good riddance, Madam Deputy Speaker, Madam Acting President. There's another example. And we know, Madam Acting President, because the Greens asked questions in Parliament about this a couple of years ago, that the heads of those multinational salmon corporations paid $4,000 a ticket to have dinner with the Premier, where they were made the promise. I know it won't be popular, but we're going to let you expand around the island. For heaven's sake, Madam Acting President. That is a perfect example of how corporate influence works against the interests of the people of Tasmania. And there is also, it is worth mentioning, Madam Acting President, that the former Chief of Staff to the former Premier now runs a PR company, Font PR, which not only owns nearly every regional and rural paper in Tasmania, has a client list which gets the red carpet treatment into ministers' offices. Madam Acting President, it's all connected. Corrupted governance, cosy corporate relationships, a PR company here that will shill for you and provide you with corporate clients. Or actually, the state of Tasmania becomes the client at some level, Madam Acting President. So we've got what's happening with the salmon industry as an example of a government that's lost touch. And I'm not going to reflect on the vote, Madam Acting President, but I've never seen a piece of legislation go through Parliament like that Stony Rise Development Bill last year. And we had a confession, in fact, quite proud. He was quite proud, the developer. He said, yeah, I've made a donation to a Liberal candidate, sure. Madam Acting President, for that donation, or maybe just because it was politically expedient, that developer had a bespoke piece of legislation passed through the Tasmanian Parliament that overrode all the planning instruments that the Tasmanian Parliament had previously agreed were necessary. Pokies, salmon, developers, whoever else rolls in the door with a pocket full of cash, Madam Acting President. And that is why we got the State of the State address that we did, Madam Acting President, because it wasn't about the people of Tasmania. It wasn't. It is not a re-elected government with a fresh mandate. Anything that is refreshed about this team is only embodied, as I understand it, in the newly elected member for Bass, Rob Fairs. That's it, I think. I think that's the extent of the refreshal of the team. The only new ideas in this State of the State address: privatisation, massive cuts to public services, and this bizarre and again Trumpian agenda of deregulation, which is childish. As we asked downstairs, does this mean we're going to have to babysit you for the next 3 years as you try to replace one, if you introduce one regulation, you're going to take out 2 more? It is ridiculous, Madam Acting President. There are no new ideas coming out of this government. And we get rubbish in this speech. I mean, the first page of this State of the State speech, the first 2 minutes, were laced with misinformation at best, lies at worst. This number, 4,000 social and affordable homes. Show us the proof, Minister, because we think you've been counting, for example, vacant land and refurbishments among those 4,000 social and affordable homes. It certainly doesn't say new. social and affordable homes. But given how few new social homes had been built prior to the last state election, the idea, it just defies mathematical logic, Madam Acting President, the idea that the government's built 3,000 more since then, well, you'd have to be very generous of spirit to accept that. Yes, it's true. The government has rolled out a plan to deliver healthy lunches to even more schools, and well done to this minister. And I do note that this minister not only has a very good heart, but is very much focused on the people of Tasmania. And I might just take this opportunity, Madam Acting President, to apologise for my intemperate interjection yesterday about the Liberal Party in relation to women's issues. I recognise that within the Liberal Party of Tasmania there are some terrific and strong-minded and big-hearted women. I wish there were more, but I am sorry for my interjection yesterday. But we do have healthier lunches in school, but how come we still haven't cracked Year 12 attainment? How come our NAPLAN results are still lagging and in some cases declining? Now, it's not this minister's fault. It's not even necessarily a government's fault, but it's a sign of a government that wasn't paying attention to the basics. Too busy sucking up to the gambling lobby or big salmon to have a look at what's happening in public education and go, let's make this a focus and a singular focus of our government. Remember, we were going to be the healthiest state in the nation in 2025. Here we are, Madam Acting President. So that was an ambition that went nowhere, a slogan that was just hot air in the end. But we're such a small island and an island community, Madam Acting President, and we have so much capacity and talent in our people and promise in our kids. Educational attainment is a wicked problem we could tackle within a generation and make a substantive and meaningful difference and be the most creative, the brightest, the most resilient and connected and highly educated across whatever form that education takes. It doesn't have to be university, TAFE, adult ed, learning, lifelong learning. We could be that because of the kind of community we are, because we are an island, because we have a population where you can introduce policy that makes a tangible and measurable difference if you stay the course, Madam Acting President. But after 11 years of the Liberals, it's good that there's more healthy school lunches, but that focus that should have been there from the beginning hasn't been there, and the ROGS data confirms that. Madam Acting President, we're told by the Premier that every 100 days the Liberals hold themselves accountable to their plan. Well, that's bloody terrific, Madam Acting President. No, that's really great. They're not accountable to themselves in the Parliamentary Liberal Party meeting room. They're accountable to the people of Tasmania, Madam Acting President. They're accountable in the other place and they're accountable here. But what we're seeing and what will be the effect of the measures outlined, should they come to bear fruit in the State of the State address, that is mass deregulation, is that this government will become less accountable. Our community is likely to become less healthy and safe. Our environment is likely to have less protections, and there's likely to be even less transparency, Madam Acting President. So it's very nice that they hold themselves accountable every 100 days. Now, as pointed out by the Honourable Member for Nelson, there wasn't a lot of leadership in the Premier's State of the State address, and he belled the cat early on in. Today I will focus on one thing, and one thing only, a strong economy. Madam Acting President, we're not an economy. We're a community. We're an island community, sustained by an extraordinary natural environment. We're a community which has very significant social problems, Madam Acting President, that if we do work together, and we can in a balance of power parliament, as we've shown this week, we can tackle those problems. We've got fantastic, the best social infrastructure in the country, which is our neighbourhood houses and child and family learning centres. That is the seedbed for massive social and economic change, Madam Acting President. We could do this. But these are community issues. We live in a community, and it's insulting and Trumpian and alarming to hear from the Premier of this state that he thinks we live in an economy. What's that old saying, Madam Acting President? There's no jobs on a dead planet. No mention of the environment in this State of the State address. No attention paid. No mention of our waste issues, of the need to protect our forests. No mention of the threat of climate change to our parks and reserves. Madam Acting President, no future plan for keeping Tasmanians safe from the increasing risk of highly intense bushfires, floods, sea level rise, storm surge. Madam Acting President, we had none of that. And that's where the absence of leadership is so frustrating and so frightening. We will all acknowledge and give government a big tick for its commitment to the Commission of Inquiry and to funding its recommendations and to making sure that those recommendations are implemented. Former Premier Peter Gutman, he was under enormous pressure at the time, but it did take guts to say, pretty early on in your government too, even though he left shortly after, but pretty early on, yes, we will undertake a commission of inquiry because we regard the historical and, as we understand it, contemporary harm being done to children in institutional settings as completely unacceptable. And that commission of inquiry process has been traumatic for people who've been through it, for victim survivors, for people who've given evidence, for people who've watched it. It's been very traumatic, I think, to the broader Tasmanian community to understand what historically and potentially to this day we don't stop from happening to children. And so I do want to commend the government for their work, dedicated work on the Commission of Inquiry and implementing its recommendations. But it does bring me back briefly to the Integrity Commission, Madam Acting President, because the Integrity Commission's workload has increased substantially as a result of the Commission of Inquiry. It will increase more as a result of the implementation of the Weiss Review recommendations. It is a part of the transparency and accountability architecture of this state that requires fortifying and consistent government support. And you can't separate the lack of funding and empowerment of the Integrity Commission and the National Preventative Mechanism from the evidence, findings and recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry. I know the state's finances are not just straightened, Madam Acting President, they're desperate. We get that. But the kind of money, the kind of funding that our statutory bodies, and I'll include the Ombudsman in this as well, are asking for simply to be able to properly fulfil their statutory functions is relatively small change for government. Madam Acting President, so I do hope that in this upcoming state budget we see some of the repair from government for those statutory organisations, a recognition that they've been unduly deprived of the funding that they need, and allocations made in the state budget. Now, in the Premier's State of the State address, he said, as if it was a good thing, over recent weeks we've released a number of initiatives to drive change around planning regulations in our state. Well, DAPS went down very well in here last year, Madam Acting President. You'll recall that debate. The government's attempt to cut out the middleman, woman or non-binary person from the planning process was dealt with and dispatched by this place as it should have been. And now they're coming back for more, Madam Acting President. More attempts to stop hearing the Tasmanian people, to play deaf to their local concerns, for example, that they have a right to bring through planning processes. They're going to have another crack at it. Such is their arrogance, Madam Acting President. What are they thinking? Is it all and only about sending a message to business? Is that what this is? I certainly hope that this House of Review treats the next attempt that the government has to cut the Tasmanian people and local government out of the planning process is dealt with just as effectively and efficiently by this council as it was last time. Yes. So one of the hallmarks of far-right politics, and we're creeping in that direction, there's no doubt about it, Madam Acting President, is misogyny. And there's a line in here, it came straight from Scott Morrison. As I've said, if you wear a high vis, you have no greater supporter than this Liberal government. Now, of course, I know there are plenty of women in trades, Madam Acting President. What's your trade, Leader of Government Business?
Agriculture.
Oh, great.
You can call me a tradesman. I'm not sexist. I don't care.
Do you wear a high-vis vest?
I do at times.
In the sale yard.
But in acknowledging that there are a growing number of female tradespeople, it's still overwhelmingly those professions are filled by men, and that is a blokey, Trumpian, Morrison-esque signal about what this government is all about. Then he goes on to say entrepreneurs are the engine of our economy. No, they're not. No, they're not, Madam Acting President. The Tasmanian people. The Tasmanian people are the engine of our economy. Workers of all skills and abilities and ages, including volunteers, they are the engine of our economy. In the same way that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Bezos, those parasitic billionaire entrepreneurs in the US, are not the engine of that huge economy, Madam Acting President, entrepreneurs are an important part of our society and our economy, but they're not the engine of it. The Tasmanian people are. There would be no economy without the hard work of the people we represent, wherever they live on this beautiful island. Yes, well, the Premier wants to be number one, the best place to do business. How about being, number one in health? Healthiest state in the nation. How about an aspiration like that again and actually sticking to it? How about being the most creative and skilled state in the nation? No, we just want to be number one at doing business. Boring, but also a recipe for dodgy deals, more of the same stuff that work against the public interest. Madam President, we had the extraordinary claim in the State of the State speech that regulators can both protect and build. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of a regulator, which is to regulate construction and building so that there are standards in place that don't put people's lives at risk, don't put workers at risk. Madam Acting President, it is a recipe for dodgy deals and shoddy construction. Madam Acting President, this statement, in coming months we'll be stripping back licensing requirements. I'll bet you I know who's first in line for that. It'll be the salmon industry or the gambling industry. They'll come up and have a bleat about some licence condition that they have to follow that's been put in there at some level to protect the public interest or protect the environment. It'll be the Liberal donors who are lining up with the regulations in their hands that they want to have removed. Madam Acting President. And it raises a very significant question about the process here and the role of Parliament. The Subordinate Legislation Committee is about to become one of the most important entities in this place. We've got a government that is threatening to set aside whole days of Parliament's work to repeal and remove legislation. It wants to repeal regulations which it can just do quietly, as I understand it, off the side of a minister's desk, and you don't find out until some time afterwards. Madam Acting President, it's Parliament's role to review, where necessary, repair, and to strengthen our regulatory and legislative framework, which is put in place in the interests of the people of Tasmania. We're not here to, what's the word that he used? We're going to smash things. He's going to smash things. That's what the Premier said. He's going to smash regulations, slash red tape. That's not our job. We're here to review, repair, and where necessary, strengthen legislation. And if there needs to be new laws, we're here to make them. We're not here to break and smash up laws. Madam Acting President. Oh yeah, here it is. Too much red tape, he says. Business hate it, and I agree, so we're taking a slasher to it. Donald. So Donald, I'd love to know who wrote this Trumpian vomit. We are going to hunt down red tape. What's been happening for the past 11 years? We had a red tape commissioner. I think we still do. Madam Acting President, he's the Office of the Coordinator General, isn't he?
Been doing the whole audit.
Oh, so we've had a red tape commissioner in the Office of the Coordinator General who's been working on this project for 11 years, and only now we've just discovered there, maybe there might be a bit much regulation, and so we're going to take a slasher to it. What Premier thinks that is appropriate language for dealing with regulatory instruments? It is a Premier who's taking his marching orders from the likes of the Minister for Transport, Mr Abetz, the Minister for Skills, Mr Ellis, Madam Acting President, and of course the Deputy Premier, Treasurer, Attorney General and Minister for Justice, who thought it would be a nice idea to spend his summer holiday attending a fashy little conference in London with some of the world's worst climate deniers, racists and misogynists, and then comes back here and sets up our own Doge. Madam Acting President, I just want to, before I begin to wind up, I just want to challenge strongly a statement that the Premier made, another untrue statement. He said people want government out of their lives. See, someone made a mistake when they wrote this. What they meant to write for him was that big business and corporations want government out of their lives because people very much want government in their lives. They want to know government's there to provide the health services that they pay for and deserve. They want to know that government is there investing in public education so that their children and grandchildren can have the education and opportunities that they deserve. They want to know that government's there when they're in crisis, if they need crisis accommodation. They want to know that government's investing in social and affordable housing. They want to feel safe in their communities. They want a sense of peace and security. And those things, Madam Acting President, they come from good governance. Tasmanians most certainly want a good government in their lives. And they decided at the last state election that the government that they had at the time wasn't quite good enough. And so they didn't give them a mandate, Madam Acting President. They decided not to, because they wanted a good government in their lives. And what we have now is a very interesting and potentially very productive political situation that's been almost gifted to us by the people of Tasmania. And that is a power-sharing parliament. And we're seeing come through this place, Madam Acting President, transformative reform, not from government, but from the crossbench, from the Labor opposition, from the Greens. We've repealed the crime of begging because this is a balance of power parliament. We've cleaned up donations because this is a balance of power parliament. I'll just make a short pitch, Madam Acting President, for why you might think about. Why would you vote Green? You vote Green because we'll always put the interests of this island, this beautiful island, and its people first. We will always act with honour and honesty and integrity. And we will use every opportunity that we have in both houses of this parliament to get good results for the Tasmanian people and make sure this beautiful island is looked after. And if the government of the day can't be delivering good legislation and good regulation and won't act to deliver a safe climate, to look after our forests, make sure we've got clean, fresh drinking water, the Greens will be in here fighting for those things as we always have. I know this frustrates you, Leader of Government Business, when I talk about the green stuff, but that's why the people of Hobart elected me. I'm very happy for you to provoke a quarrel. Just saying. Anytime. So, Madam Acting President, more language in here about we're going to keep looking and we're going to keep ripping it down. We're going to have a look at the laws and regulations on the statute books and the ones that we can ditch. Well, I've got news for the Premier. It's not him who ditches legislation. If there's any legislation to be changed or repealed or preferably improved, it's our job to do that. It's the privilege that we were given and the responsibility that we were given by the people of Tasmania. More dishonesty laced through here. Our debt level is manageable, he said. My God, that is a complete and utter fabrication, Madam Acting President. Oh, yes, and then there's all the threats to sell our government businesses through his speech, and he talks about them paying down debt, which, as we know, would be a very short-term sugar hit for which the people of Tasmania would suffer a profound and generational loss. A loss of the revenue, the dividends, for example, that comes from the MAIB. A loss of the affordable services that comes from the public trustee that they want to gut. The loss of an affordable bus trip, Madam Acting President. So, Madam Acting President, I just want to close with the concerns of my community in the City of Hobart. To thank the Hobart City Council for their excellent 2040 Climate Ready Hobart strategy. This is a strategy that was developed very closely with the local community and council and local businesses, and it talks about how we can become the most climate ready and resilient city in the country. And this is what the people in my electorate of Hobart, most beautiful Nipaluna Hobart, say about this is what the children of Hobart say about the future. I want to be able to hear lots of birds all day and see many animals in the ocean. I want everyone to be happy and everyone to be safe. A lot more electric vehicles and ways to get around. And in brackets there, Madam Acting President, let's hope they're not Teslas, the swastikas. And the kids, of course, want to see wildlife protected and abundant and where renewable energy is plentiful. If a government is listening to the children, and I implore the Premier to do this, don't view this island through the dark and singular lens of money, because this island is not about money. Obviously, we need to find ways to generate more revenue and to drive down debt, and I refer honourable members to the Greens policy to make corporations pay to make sure that, you know, what we charge for mining leases at least meets the national average. There's plenty of ways to generate revenue if you're prepared to take on the big end of town in the way other states and territories have, mind you, and businesses keep coming. But if you're going to be a true leader, Madam Acting President, for all Tasmanian people, not just for people in high vests, not just for the Farrell family, but if you're going to be a true leader for all Tasmanian people, the first thing you could do is listen to the kids. That would be the first thing you could do, because children's hopes and dreams for the future, they were not reflected. They were not in the State of the State address. They were forgotten and they were ignored, Madam Acting President, because a real leader would have come in and delivered a triple bottom line State of the State address, would have been honest about our economic circumstances, taken responsibility to the greatest extent possible, notwithstanding the shocks that this government has had to experience through the pandemic and the Commission of Inquiry. You'd be honest about the financial circumstances of the state. You'd say we are going to have to generate revenue. We may need to do that through adjusting some levies. We are going to have a look at, for example, mineral licences and royalty fees and the licence fees that the salmon industry pays. There may be some tight belting necessary. There will be. But we'll do this with you. We're not going to sell off the family silver, having not told you that that was our plan when we asked you to vote for us last time. It would have talked about protecting the human rights, real leadership, protecting the human rights of the Tasmanian people. A real progressive leader, like Jeremy Rockcliffe could have been, given his nature, might have said, we're committed to protecting the human rights of the Tasmanian people through a Human Rights Act for Tasmania, like other evolved democracies. A real leader would have come in here in his State of the State address, having looked at what happened on the northwest coast and the west coast with those terrifying fires over the summer, having understood that we are in extreme marine heatwave conditions, that our communities are vulnerable and people are frightened. They are frightened. And he would have said, we've got a plan. We're going to adapt to the effects of global heating, but we're also going to work that much harder. We're going to redouble our efforts to lower emissions so we can be a beacon to the world. And in order to do that, as Premier, I'm saying to you, to the people of Tasmania, the science says we need to end native forest logging and protect our forests. And the great news about that is, people of Tasmania, that when we do that, we can protect all the life that those forests support. I feel for Jeremy Rockcliffe, Madam Acting President, I really do. You know, he's got a good heart. He's always had a good heart. He's a nice guy. He's a bit weak. But this State of the State address was a disgrace. It was Trumpian. It was dogy. It had the fingerprints of Guy Barnett and Eric Abetz all over it. I don't think it's really Jeremy Rockcliffe's vision for Tasmania. If it is, how far he has fallen. How far he has fallen, Madam Acting President. So the good news is we have members in this place and members in the other place who are dedicated, and clearly so, who will hold government to account on the statements made and the threats made in this State of the State address. And when the budget time comes down, the Greens will be looking at that very closely, Madam Acting President. And as always, we will put forward a fully costed, triple bottom line budgetary vision for Tasmania, Madam Acting President, that puts this beautiful island, the most beautiful place in the world, and its people fully front and centre of everything that we do from there on, as we always have, put this island and its people first.